You wake up in the dark, and the cold has already found you. It is under your clothes. It is inside your boots. It sits on your chest like something patient that has been waiting all night for you to move first. For roughly 2,000 generations of your ancestors, this was simply what a morning felt like. A research team led by Neil Klepheis once measured how modern people actually spend their hours and found that the average person now lives about 87% of their life indoors, inside a temperature somebody else selected. Your ancestors spent almost none of theirs that way. And around 20,000 years ago, a small number of them walked straight into the coldest country any human being had ever tried to occupy. They were not lost, they were not fleeing, they walked in because that was where the food was. So put yourself there. What did it actually feel like? Start with the ground under your feet, because almost everything you are picturing right now is wrong. You are imagining white, endless snow, ice cliffs, a blank, frozen desert. That is not what your ancestors walked across. The land between Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age was not buried under an ice sheet at all. It was far too dry for one. The paleontologist Dale Guthrie spent decades reconstructing that vanished world from the bones and pollen still locked in its soil. And the name he helped make famous for it is the mammoth steppe. Picture cold grassland instead. Wind-scoured, dry, pale gold, running out past the limit of your eyes. Grass, sage, low tough herbs, almost no trees because trees need water that the wind will not let them keep. And animals. Staggering numbers of animals. Steppe bison, wild horses, reindeer, woolly rhinoceros, mammoth. This was one of the largest grazing ecosystems the planet has ever produced, and it ran unbroken from Europe across Siberia and out onto the exposed floor of what is now the Bering Sea. So much of the world's water was frozen into ice sheets that sea level sat roughly 120 meters lower than today. The seabed was dry country. Geologists call that drowned subcontinent Beringia. Your ancestors did not cross a bridge, they lived in a homeland. It simply went under the water afterwards. So, how long had human beings been surviving up there? Longer than anyone expected. In northern Siberia, on the Yana River at 71 degrees north, well above the Arctic Circle, the archaeologist Vladimir Petulko excavated a site that changed the timeline. It was not a brief hunting stop. There were spear foreshafts of mammoth ivory and rhinoceros horn, thousands of stone tools, beads, and needles. And it was 32,000 years old. People were living and raising children in the high Arctic more than 10,000 years before the Ice Age even reached its coldest point. How is that survivable? Not with fire alone, not with courage, with sewing. The anthropologist Ian Gilligan has argued for years that the technology which opened the Arctic to our species was not the spear and not the hearth. It was fitted clothing. Clothing with seams. A hide draped over your shoulders will keep you alive at -5. It will not keep you alive at -40 in a moving wind. For that, you need a closed system. Sleeves sealed at the wrist, a hood that shields your face, boots stitched tight enough to stay dry. Layer on layer, trapping warm air against your skin and refusing to leak it. And to build that, you need one small, unglamorous, precisely engineered object, the eyed needle. A sliver of bone or ivory, ground thin, with a hole drilled through one end so a sinew thread can be pulled through hide. That hole is one of the most consequential inventions in human history, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. You can still see what it produced. At Sunghir in Russia, archaeologists uncovered burials around 34,000 years old in which the dead were covered with thousands of mammoth ivory beads. The beads were not scattered loose. They ran in lines that traced caps, jackets, trousers, and footwear. Tailored garments printed into the ground by the shape of their own decoration. Your ancestors did not endure the cold. They engineered their way out of it. So let's reconstruct one day of this. You wake before the light, because the fire has burned low and the cold has crept back in. The camp is small, a handful of families, hide shelters weighted with bone and stone, angled against the wind, which never fully stops. Someone builds the fire back up. Fuel is a constant problem because there are no forests here, so you burn bone, dried dung, and driftwood carried from somewhere else. You eat meat, almost only meat, fat especially, because in a place this cold, fat is not indulgence. It is fuel, and lean meat alone will slowly starve you, no matter how much of it you swallow. Then, before anything else happens, someone checks the clothing. This is the real work of your morning. Every seam is inspected. Damp liners are pulled out and dried by the fire, because sweat that freezes inside a garment can kill you faster than the air outside it. A split along a boot is repaired immediately. With a needle, you would guard more carefully than a blade. In this world, a woman with a needle is not doing housework. She is operating the life support system. Then you move. Not far. Perhaps 10 or 15 kilometers, following the herd, reading the ground for tracks and dung and the direction the grazing has drifted. You carry everything you own. There is no road. There is no map. There is no destination. And this is where the story you have been told falls apart, because there was no migration. Nobody in that camp woke up intending to discover a continent. No one gathered the families and announced that they were going to America. The genetic and archaeological evidence points to something far stranger and far more human. In 2007, a team including Erica Tam published work on Native American DNA, suggesting that the ancestors of every indigenous American population sat isolated somewhere in the Beringian region for thousands of years before entering the Americas. John Hoffaker, Scott Elias, and Dennis O'Rourke later laid out the environmental case for it, pointing to pockets of shrub and woodland in central Beringia, where people could find fuel and shelter. They call it the Beringian standstill. Sit with that word, standstill. The greatest journey in the history of our species was mostly spent not moving. Generation after generation, born, married, buried in the same cold country, on a landmass that no longer exists, unaware that they were the seed population of two continents. And when the movement finally came, it was not a march. Spread the distance across the time, and it averages out to something absurd. A few kilometers a year. Less in places, slower than a child walks before breakfast. The greatest expansion in human history happened at a speed nobody alive could have noticed. What did it leave behind? At Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, the archaeologist Lauriane Bourgeon re-examined old animal bones and identified cut marks made by stone tools, pushing a human presence in the region back further than most researchers had accepted. At White Sands in New Mexico, a team led by Matthew Bennett studied fossilized footprints preserved in ancient lakebed mud, not artifacts, footprints, bare human feet, some of them belonging to children, and one trackway of a young person carrying a toddler, setting the child down, picking the child up again, walking on. That is what survives from the frozen frontier. Not a monument, a parent's tired arms. And at Monteverde in southern Chile, Tom Delahaye excavated a settlement roughly 14,500 years old with preserved wooden structures, cords, and plant remains at the far southern end of the hemisphere. Think about the distance between those two places, from the Arctic edge of Siberia to the forests of southern Chile. Nobody planned that. It happened one hunting decision at a time, each one made by people who thought they were simply following food through a hard winter. Now come back to your own morning. You still have the same body, the same core temperature, the same narrow survivable range, the same shivering reflex that your ancestors carried across the mammoth steppe. What you no longer have is the exposure. You outsourced it. You live inside a heated shell inside another heated shell, and you can move between them without your skin ever learning what the day is actually doing. and you inherited something else from those people, something quieter. They had no idea they were doing anything historic. They were cold and tired and worried about a split seam, and they moved because the animals moved. The most consequential migration our species ever made looked, from the inside, like an ordinary week that went slightly badly. Yours probably does too. So the next time your life feels like standing still, remember what standing still actually built. Thousands of years of people in one cold place doing the same small maintenance every morning, keeping the fire alive, checking the stitches, feeding the children, and going almost nowhere. 2 continents came out of that. Tomorrow morning, you will wake up in the dark and the cold will not find you. Someone else already handled it, but it was handled first by a person crouched by a low fire at the top of the world, holding a needle made of bone, deciding that today the seam would hold.